There are two prisons in America that were never meant to compete, yet they did. ADX Florence in Colorado, Pelican Bay in California. Both were built to bury violence, and both became symbols of it. Behind the concrete, steel, and silence, an invisible war began, between two prisons fighting for the title of America's most secure hell. If you're fascinated by the hidden world of maximum security and the dark history of U.S. prisons, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Let's go inside the rivalry that shaped modern incarceration. The story of this rivalry starts long before either prison existed. In the 1970s and 80s, America's prisons were on fire. Across the country, riots erupted, from Attica in New York to Marion in Illinois. Correctional officers were killed. Inmates were burned alive. Each riot sent a message: the system had lost control. At Marion Federal Penitentiary, once the highest security prison in America, a pair of murders changed everything. In 1983, two correctional officers, Merle Klutz and Robert Hoffman, were killed by members of the Aryan Brotherhood. The attacks happened just hours apart, planned with military precision. It was the moment that forced the government to rethink how it handled the most dangerous prisoners in the country. Marion went into permanent lockdown. Every man was confined to his cell for 23 hours a day. This was the birth of the control unit, a model built on isolation instead of rehabilitation. But isolation couldn't stop the flow of violence, it only concentrated it. Federal reports revealed that gangs used coded letters, legal mail, and even family visits to continue their operations. The Bureau of Prisons realized it needed a place beyond Marion, something unbreakable, escape-proof, and psychologically crushing. That idea became the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum, better known as ADX Florence. Built in 1994, deep in the desert of Colorado, ADX was designed to hold the most violent, most escape-prone inmates in the federal system. Each cell was a concrete box, soundproof, window slit only 4 inches wide, no direct human contact. It was engineered for sensory deprivation, a cleaner form of punishment that replaced chaos with silence. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, California faced its own storm. In the 1980s, gang violence inside its prisons reached historic levels. The Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla Family turned cell blocks into war zones. Shootings, stabbings, and riots became almost weekly events. California needed its own fortress, one powerful enough to isolate the leaders who controlled the violence from inside. So in 1989, Pelican Bay State Prison opened near the Oregon border. It was built in a remote forest, miles away from any major city, deliberately cut off from the world. The centerpiece was the Security Housing Unit, or SHU, a windowless maze of concrete pods designed to separate gang shot callers from their soldiers. Just like ADX, the cells had no physical contact, no programs, no freedom. The only thing an inmate could hear was the hum of the ventilation and the echo of their own thoughts. Both prisons were meant to end violence. Instead, they created a new kind of competition, one that few outside the system even knew existed. Federal agents studied Pelican Bay's control methods. California borrowed intelligence tactics from ADX. Behind closed doors, a silent arms race began, not with weapons but with policies, psychology, and surveillance. The rivalry wasn't official. It was born from pride, the belief that their system worked better, their walls were stronger, their minds were tougher to break. And for the men locked inside, that meant one thing: endless isolation, decades of silence, and a life sentence inside a box. By the mid-1990s, both prisons had settled into rhythm, a rhythm of silence. But behind that silence, another kind of war had begun. Not a riot, not a lockdown, an intelligence war. When ADX Florence opened, the Bureau of Prisons knew one truth: gangs were built on communication. Cut that off and power collapses. So the federal government created one of the most secretive prison intelligence networks in the country. Agents posed as maintenance staff. Mail was scanned, mirrored, decoded. Conversations were transcribed from vent systems and recreation cages. Every whisper mattered. Every word could expose a new gang order or hit list. At Pelican Bay, California's Department of Corrections took a similar path, but with its own twist. Instead of relying only on surveillance, they began turning gang members into informants. They called it debriefing. If an inmate revealed everything he knew about his gang, codes, names, operations, he could earn a transfer out of the SHU. Freedom from isolation came at a heavy price: betrayal. Debriefing created deep fractures inside the prison world. Old alliances broke apart. The Mexican Mafia suspected everyone. Nuestra Familia began rotating their lieutenants weekly to avoid infiltration. The Aryan Brotherhood executed anyone even rumored to be talking to staff. For investigators, this paranoia was useful. Fear became a tool more effective than force. And both prisons, ADX and Pelican Bay, quietly competed to see who could dismantle gang power faster. Federal memos described ADX as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, a laboratory for total control. Its intelligence unit worked with the FBI and DEA to map criminal networks that stretched from Colorado cells to cartel strongholds in Mexico. Pelican Bay's institutional gang investigators, the IGI, responded by building their own underground database. They tracked tattoos, coded drawings, even slang words carved into soap bars. Every discovery was a trophy. Every intercepted letter was a victory. But in this race for control, both systems went too far. Inmates were kept in isolation for years, sometimes decades, based only on confidential information. No trial. No appeal. Just a file, sealed away in a cabinet labeled Security Threat Group. Psychologists began sounding alarms. Men who entered sane began hallucinating. Some screamed through the night. Others refused to speak at all. Yet, to the agencies running these facilities, silence meant success. A quiet prison was a controlled prison. Then stories started leaking. Letters smuggled out from Pelican Bay described abuse, beatings, and forced confessions during debriefings. At ADX, civil rights lawyers filed suits claiming prisoners were trapped in endless solitary without mental health care. The public started asking, were these prisons solving violence, or simply hiding it behind concrete? In 2012, a group of ADX inmates, including high-profile terrorists and gang leaders, sued the Bureau of Prisons for cruel and unusual punishment. In California, thousands of inmates launched hunger strikes demanding an end to indefinite solitary confinement. Suddenly, the two most feared prisons in America were also the most controversial. Still, inside their command centers, officers believed they were fighting a war the public would never understand. To them, every file, every snitch, every intercepted word saved lives. And between ADX and Pelican Bay, no one wanted to be second best. This was the era when isolation became intelligence. And intelligence became power. Inside these walls, the war was no longer about gangs. It was about control of the mind. Every prison has bars. ADX Florence and Pelican Bay went further. They built silence as a weapon. 23 hours a day, men were locked in concrete boxes no larger than a parking space. 1 hour in a caged yard, alone. No phone calls. No programs. No sound except the echo of your own breathing. Psychologists who studied long-term isolation called it clean torture. No blood. No bruises. Just slow psychological collapse. The Bureau of Prisons denied it. So did California's Department of Corrections. But inside, officers saw what was happening. Men who once led gangs began talking to themselves. Others refused food, convinced it was poisoned. Some scratched messages into the walls, hoping someone somewhere might read them one day. At ADX Florence, inmates nicknamed the place the Alcatraz of the Rockies. They said it was built to make you forget who you were. A former warden described it bluntly. It's not designed for rehabilitation. It's designed for people we want to disappear. In Pelican Bay's SHU, the feeling was the same, only colder. The fluorescent lights never went off completely. The temperature stayed low enough that inmates slept fully clothed. The food came through a slot, sliding like an afterthought. Human contact became a rumor. Over time, the brain adapts to isolation, but not in healthy ways. Neuroscientists found that prisoners kept in solitary for years lose the ability to read facial expressions or control emotions. Hallucinations become normal. Dreams and reality start to blur. When released into general population or the free world, some couldn't stand bright light or open spaces. Their minds had been rewired by silence. Pelican Bay officers claimed that isolation worked. Violence dropped inside the main yard. But critics argued that it simply buried the problem underground. At ADX, wardens said the same. No riots, no fights, no escapes. Yet every victory came at a human cost. Suicides quietly increased. Guards grew numb. Psych staff rotated fast. Most couldn't handle the despair that lived inside those walls. One federal inspector described walking through ADX as entering a tomb where the dead still breathe. At Pelican Bay, a state psychologist wrote that many prisoners become so detached that they no longer recognize time itself. And through it all, each institution watched the other. ADX tracked California's lawsuits and adjusted its policies to stay ahead. Pelican Bay studied federal training manuals to refine its interrogation and debriefing tactics. Neither wanted to look weaker, softer, or less in control. Their rivalry now extended beyond security. It was a battle over philosophy. Which model would America choose to copy? The federal silence of Florence, or the Californian darkness of Crescent City? By the early 2000s, both had become legends, whispered names in courtrooms, documentaries, and law enforcement briefings. For some officers, serving there was a badge of honor. For others, it was a burden they could never explain to family. Because inside ADX Florence and Pelican Bay, punishment wasn't measured in years. It was measured in days of sanity left. By the early 2000s, the names ADX Florence and Pelican Bay had spread far beyond prison walls. They were no longer just facilities, they were blueprints. Every state wanted its own version of total control. After September 11th, that influence grew stronger. The fear of terrorism gave prison administrators new power and new funding. ADX became the symbol of ultimate security, a place to bury threats that couldn't exist anywhere else. Federal reports called it the safest, most secure prison in the world. To politicians, it was proof that America could contain evil inside four walls. Pelican Bay's model spread too, especially across state prisons dealing with gang wars. The idea was simple: isolate leaders, cut communication, and stability will follow. Soon, similar supermax units appeared in Texas, Ohio, Illinois, and Virginia. The same gray walls. The same echoing silence. The same absence of hope. What began as an experiment became policy, a quiet revolution in American incarceration. Wardens visited ADX and Pelican Bay like scientists studying a successful formula. They took notes on architecture, surveillance, and even color design. Every detail had a purpose. Light placement, sound levels, the thickness of cell doors, all optimized to suppress emotion and reaction. But the success came with a price: human disconnection. Rehabilitation programs were defunded. Therapy was replaced with discipline. Instead of asking why men became violent, the system focused on how to contain them. The result? A national network of silence, prisons across the country mirroring the two giants that started it all. At the same time, both ADX and Pelican Bay were under investigation. Lawyers, journalists, and human rights groups began exposing the hidden costs of this new lockdown culture. Lawsuits filed by former inmates painted a chilling picture: years of solitary confinement without cause, medical neglect, and psychological torment. Reports from Amnesty International compared the conditions to mental health experiments gone wrong. Still, the officials inside both facilities stood by their systems. They claimed these prisons prevented chaos, saved staff lives, and reduced murders inside the system. And in a way they were right. Homicides dropped in both states. Gang communication networks weakened. But another crisis was quietly growing: the mental collapse of thousands of inmates who would one day be released back into society. At Pelican Bay, families spoke out. Mothers described sons who no longer recognized their voices over the phone. Wives received letters written in circles, pages filled with meaningless scribbles, the product of a mind breaking apart. At ADX, defense lawyers told stories of men who screamed through the night until their throats bled. Some officers admitted that the silence became unbearable even for them. Many lasted only a few years before transferring out. Yet, for those in command, every complaint was dismissed as weakness. To them, security was sacred. Compassion was a liability. And the unspoken rivalry between ADX and Pelican Bay continued quietly through policy papers, architectural designs, and federal training manuals. Each wanted to be the model the nation followed, the standard for maximum control. By 2010, that goal was achieved. Supermax prisons had become the backbone of America's punishment system. From Arizona's SMU-2 to Pennsylvania's SCI Green, the fingerprints of Florence and Pelican Bay were everywhere. The experiment had gone national. What no one expected, though, was that the world would soon see behind the walls. Former guards, whistleblowers, and even ex-inmates began to speak publicly. And what they revealed would change everything, exposing the cost of a culture that valued silence more than sanity. For years, the silence was complete. Reporters could only guess what went on behind the walls of ADX Florence and Pelican Bay. But silence never lasts forever. The first cracks appeared from the inside, not from riots but from words. A few correctional officers, worn down by guilt and nightmares, began to speak quietly to journalists and lawyers. They described what the public never saw: prisoners screaming through the night, men pacing until their feet bled, and others smearing walls with messages written in dust and despair. In 2003, The New York Times published one of the first in-depth reports on Pelican Bay's SHU. It detailed years of lawsuits, broken policies, and psychological devastation. A federal judge called the conditions inhumane beyond reason. At the same time, whistleblowers from ADX Florence began leaking documents to human rights organizations, revealing just how extreme the isolation really was. Some prisoners hadn't touched another human being in over a decade. They lived in a cycle of silence, sensory deprivation, and self-destruction. One inmate wrote, "The walls hum louder than my thoughts." Lawyers from the American Civil Liberties Union and Human Rights Watch started gathering testimony. They found patterns, nearly identical between the two institutions. Pelican Bay's debriefing system was accused of coercion. ADX's mental health program was accused of neglect. Different states, same suffering. When the media got hold of the documents, the illusion of perfect control began to fade. The public had been told these were the safest prisons in America. Now they were seeing the cost of that safety. Inside ADX, wardens clamped down even harder. Officers were warned never to speak to outsiders. Pelican Bay increased surveillance on mail and legal visits. Both facilities believed the same thing: leaks were threats and threats had to be crushed. But the truth was already spreading. By 2011, former inmates who had survived the SHU and ADX's control units began telling their stories online and in documentaries. They spoke of hallucinations, suicide attempts, and the feeling that time itself had stopped. Some became advocates, working with reform groups to end long-term solitary confinement. Others couldn't function outside the walls. They reoffended just to go back to the only world they understood. Then came a moment no one expected. In 2013, nearly 30,000 California inmates launched a statewide hunger strike, many of them from Pelican Bay. Their demand was simple: stop indefinite solitary confinement. The strike spread fast, forcing national attention on conditions that had been ignored for decades. Journalists compared Pelican Bay's SHU to a modern-day dungeon. Lawmakers began asking questions they had never asked before. ADX Florence faced its own reckoning a year later. A class-action lawsuit, Baycoat versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, accused the institution of cruel and unusual punishment. Inmates with severe mental illness were being locked in cells instead of treated. The Bureau of Prisons denied wrongdoing, but eventually agreed to major reforms, including mental health evaluations and new review systems for isolation. For the first time, the myth cracked. The public saw that control had a dark side, one built on secrecy and suffering. And through it all, ADX and Pelican Bay remained locked in a silent competition. Each one watched how the other handled the pressure. Each adjusted policy to stay one step ahead. Even in scandal, the rivalry never died. Because deep down, both institutions knew they weren't just prisons. They were symbols. Symbols of how far America was willing to go to keep danger contained, even if it meant becoming dangerous itself. When people think of prisons like ADX Florence or Pelican Bay, they picture the inmates, killers, gang leaders, terrorists. But few talk about the men and women who walk those same halls every day wearing a uniform. The ones who live the war from the other side of the door. Inside these fortresses, officers work in silence. No radios playing. No laughter. Just the constant echo of doors locking behind them. Every shift begins the same: metal detectors, body scans, and a gut-deep reminder that anything can happen. At ADX, guards call it the clean danger. No riots. No shouting. Just eyes, hundreds of them, watching from tiny cell slits. Each movement is timed. Each route memorized. No room for mistakes. At Pelican Bay, the pressure is heavier. The SHU officers walk miles of dim hallways every day, feeding men they'll never touch, listening to threats whispered through vents. Some guards develop their own rituals: a prayer before entering the tier, a photo of their kids tucked into a vest pocket, a silent count of steps between doors. Anything to stay grounded. The mental strain is brutal. Studies found that correctional officers at supermax prisons suffer higher rates of PTSD than police officers or soldiers returning from combat. They don't talk about it much. In that world, silence isn't just policy, it's survival. A former ADX officer once said, "You don't realize how quiet it is until you leave. Then you hear noise again and it feels wrong." He spoke of inmates who smiled at him every morning for years, though they never exchanged a word. Of one man who stopped responding one day, and never moved again. Death in these places isn't loud. It's routine. Pelican Bay staff tell similar stories. They describe walking past cells where men were drawing on the floor with soap, convinced they were painting invisible doors. Others begged for someone to just talk to them for a minute, just one voice. But rules were rules. Officers couldn't engage beyond basic commands. Any slip of empathy could be exploited later, twisted into manipulation. Over time, the walls don't just trap inmates, they trap everyone. Guards begin to mirror the isolation. They stop talking at home. They eat alone. The silence follows them out of the gate. Divorces rise. Alcohol use creeps in. Many retire early, unable to shake what the job turned them into. Both ADX and Pelican Bay have seen officers try to blow the whistle, not only on inmate abuse but on the toll the job takes. One letter from a Pelican Bay sergeant to the state legislature read, "We are told to be proud of this place. But pride fades when you start losing pieces of your soul every shift." And still, the rivalry between the prisons trickled down even to the staff. Federal guards at ADX claimed their system was more professional, more controlled. California officers countered that they faced real gang warfare, not isolated terrorists. Two worlds, each believing they bore the heavier burden. Yet in both the story was the same. No matter what side of the door you were on, everyone served time inside those walls. Some inmates counted the years. Some officers counted the scars. The rivalry was never announced. There were no meetings, no headlines, no signed memos saying, "Let's compete." But inside the agencies that ran them, ADX Florence and Pelican Bay were watching each other, always. It began with data. Federal investigators from Colorado quietly requested California's reports on gang activity, disciplinary actions, and inmate control programs. They studied Pelican Bay's step-down process, the idea that inmates could earn their way out of the SHU through good behavior. ADX administrators didn't believe in it. To them, men sent to Florence were beyond rehabilitation. But they took notes anyway. Meanwhile, California's prison officials sent staff north to tour the federal supermax. What they saw shocked even seasoned officers. No noise. No movement. Every door remotely controlled from a central command post. They returned home describing ADX as surgical isolation, a system so precise it made Pelican Bay's SHU look almost humane by comparison. Soon, both sides began testing ideas. Pelican Bay experimented with stricter male monitoring and tighter recreation schedules, trying to match ADX's control. ADX adopted elements of Pelican Bay's intelligence network, building local databases to map prison gangs and their street connections. Each claimed success first. Each refused to admit failure. By the late 2000s, the rivalry became something bigger, a quiet competition for influence over national prison policy. ADX represented federal order. Clean, emotionless, absolute. Pelican Bay represented state-level pragmatism. Brutal but adaptable. And every new warden or corrections director wanted to align with one model or the other. In 2015, after years of lawsuits and protests, California began dismantling its SHU program, a major victory for human rights advocates. To outsiders, it looked like Pelican Bay had surrendered. But inside ADX, some officials saw it differently. They believed California had simply given up control. The Bureau of Prisons doubled down on isolation, even as public pressure mounted. What neither side could admit was that both systems had failed in different ways. Pelican Bay's gang control fractured under legal and social pressure. ADX's perfection of isolation bred its own crisis of humanity. And through it all, they mirrored each other's mistakes like reflections in a concrete mirror. Even now, the two names stand apart, Florence and Pelican Bay. They represent the two ends of America's punishment spectrum. One federal, one state. But their legacy is shared, a blueprint of fear, silence, and psychological warfare disguised as security. When historians look back, they'll see more than just prisons. They'll see an arms race without guns, fought with policies, isolation, and human minds. A secret war that changed the meaning of punishment forever. In the end, no one won. Not the inmates. Not the officers. Not the system itself. ADX Florence still stands in the Colorado desert, its towers sharp against the horizon, its silence unbroken. Pelican Bay still waits in the fog of Northern California, its corridors echoing with ghosts of the SHU. Both prisons were born from blood and fear. And both proved one truth that can't be ignored. When a society builds places meant to erase people, it also erases a piece of itself. If this story opened your eyes to the hidden world of America's supermax prisons, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. There are more true stories waiting to be told, stories buried behind walls of concrete and silence. Because sometimes, the most dangerous wars aren't fought on battlefields. They're fought inside prisons.